Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. As the inaugural director of the Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto, I welcome you all to the 2024-2025 Aziz Ahmad Memorial Lecture featuring Ustad Mehr Afshan Farooqi, Professor of Urdu and South Asian Literature at the University of Virginia. We thank Professor Farooqi for accepting our invitation and joining us here in person. Professor Farooqi will speak on creating and recreating in language, re-examining the poetic interrelations between Bedil and Ghalib. The lecture will be followed by a question and answer session, providing a unique opportunity to engage with Professor Farooqi. The 2024-25 Aziz Ahmad Memorial Lecture is co-sponsored by the Center for South Asian Critical Humanities at UTM, the Iranian Studies Student Forum, the Encyclopedia Iranica Foundation. In addition to our sponsor and Bilal Hashmi, who has organized today's session, I am grateful to the Roshan Cultural Heritage Foundation and Dr. Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali for their exemplary support of the Institute of Iranian Studies. At the outset, I'd like to express our collective and individual gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people across the Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. I invite Bilal Hashmi, the Institute's brilliant coordinator, to introduce Professor Mehr Afshan Farooqi. Bilal.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tavakkuli, Ustad Muhtaram, distinguished guests, students, friends, our international audience. It's wonderful to be here today, and an especially great honor for me to introduce someone who has been a mentor, a colleague, former colleague, and a lifelong friend, Professor Mehr Afshan Farooqi. I'll say a few words about her, and the reason why we invited her here, of course, was that, as Dr. Tavakkuli mentioned, the Aziz Ahmad Lecture is a source of great pride for the Institute, not only because it's a tradition at the University of Toronto, but also because we have had a chance to really pay tribute to, of course, Dr. Tavakkuli's own work in the area of Indo-Persian studies, but also connect with a very rich and potent trend in Iranian studies more broadly, and it really helps to make that geography more expansive for our students and audiences. And really the cutting edge work that is featured in this series, one hopes, will continue. And the lecture, the fact that it has been revived now for the second year in a row is a very good sign. And we, of course, pay our tribute to the family of Aziz Ahmad, who are tuning in, Mr. Shaheen Ahmad and family, Shariar Ahmad and their loved ones. And we welcome everyone to this lecture. Mehr Afshan Farooqi is Professor of Urdu and South Asian Literature at the University of Virginia. She was born in Allahabad, India, into the learned home of Jamila Khatun Hashmi and Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, publisher and editor respectively of Shabkhun, or, depending on your lahje, Shabikhun, Urdu literature's most influential and iconoclastic literary magazine at mid-century. Now, Shabkhun, or Shabikhun again, depending on how you say it, it means night attack. And really, that magazine was so influential in Urdu letters because it really shook up the literary establishment. And so Mehr Afshan was a product of that really rich and robust literary milieu of Allahabad and later Lucknow and other cities. Steeped from an early age in the poetic and prosaic traditions of English, Persian, and Urdu, Mehr initially trained as a medievalist, obtaining her PhD in history from Allahabad University, where she also taught. Following her move to the United States in the late 1990s, she returned to the field of letters, taking up in her wide-ranging scholarship complex issues of literary culture, particularly in the context of modernity. A respected critic, translator, and anthologist, Mehr is drawn especially to literary modernism, as well as to intersections between religion and literature, history, and art history. She has edited in 2 volumes, the Oxford India Anthology of Modern Urdu Literature, Oxford University Press, 2008. This was followed in 2012 by a very interesting book. Palgrave Macmillan published her Urdu Literary Culture, an intellectual portrait of the enigmatic literary critic and aesthete, Muhammad Hassan Askari, 1919 to 1978, which also doubles as a study of what she calls, alongside her peers, vernacular modernity. In this case, in Urdu literary culture, at the moment of its rupture caused by the 1947 partition. And as I understand, in 2013, an Indian edition of this book came out under the title The Post-Colonial Mind by Oxford University Press also. A long-standing research interest for Mehr is, of course, bilingualism, the focus of this evening's lecture. And this is reflected in numerous publications, including the 2-sided canvas, Oxford University Press 2013, her edited volume on the English and Urdu novelist Ahmad Ali, 1910 to 1994, and in 2 recent authoritative monographs on Mirza Asadullah Khan Ghalib, the celebrated 19th century Persian and Urdu poet, Ghalib, A Wilderness at My Doorstep, a critical biography, which was published by Penguin Random House, Allen Lane in 2021, and more recently, Ghalib, Flowers in a Mirror, a critical commentary, also published by Penguin Random House and Allen Lane in 2024. Mehr also writes a bi-monthly featured column on Urdu literature, past and present, for Dawn, Karachi, which is Pakistan's still, I believe, leading English daily. Her memoir, A Book of Hearts, now in the final stages of production, is forthcoming with Trace Press, Toronto. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mehr Afshan Farooqi.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out on a rainy evening, although it is a beautiful evening, as Ustad Tawakkoli mentioned. I am so grateful to Professor Tawakkoli and Bilal Hashmi for inviting me to present some of my research on Ghalib. And as Bilal mentioned, I've been working on Ghalib for more than a decade now.
Taken by trains mostly to Tehran, Isfahan.
Aziz Ahmad was somebody whom I never met, but whose work I studied deeply when I was doing my master's in history at the University of Allahabad. His book was a prescribed text. It was called Studies in Indian Culture, Studies in Islamic Culture in the Indian Environment. And I was totally, I honestly don't know how to express my admiration for the kind of work that he had produced in that book, because it was very unusual to find that kind of engagement with Islamic culture in the Indian environment. Bilal sent me a some briefs about the history of the Aziz Ahmad lectures, and I am humbled to be a part of the series because I noticed that there was a long list of illustrious names who have preceded me, and I'm truly honored and humbled to be here participating in this lecture series. So let me just get down to the main points that I will be raising today. So the title of my lecture is Creating and Recreating in Language, Re-examining the Poetic Interrelations between Bedil and Ghalib. It's not, so I think the most important thing here is the re-examining part, because a lot has been written about the interrelations the poetic interrelations between Bedil and Ghalib, but most of the focus, most of the scholarly focus has been in pulling up a bunch of verses which share the same theme. You know, Ghalib has borrowed from Bedil, or Ghalib has elaborated on some idea that Bedil had expressed. But as to the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware of any work that has actually probed deeply into why Ghalib selected Bedil to be the model for his poetic journey. And I will go into this very soon. But just to give you a kind of a background to all of this, I think I need to clarify some of the stuff that is important for us to understand what I'm going to be talking about today. So the first thing is Ghalib, the Urdu poet. Most of Ghalib's fame lies on his being this amazing, outstanding Urdu poet, who nonetheless is also known for being a very difficult and a very ambiguous poet, and also critiqued for writing in a style that we call Farsi Zadeh. That means his language is riddled with Persian. So these are things that are commonly known about Ghalib, but something that we really tend to overlook is that Ghalib is also a Farsi poet. So he's an Urdu poet and he's a Farsi poet, okay? And the thing about his Farsi oeuvre is that it is 5 times as much as his Urdu. So he has made a big contribution in terms of volume, at least, to Persian, both in prose and in poetry. Now, the question is that Ghalib began his career as an Urdu poet, and he is writing in the 19th century. And before him, there have been many illustrious Urdu poets. There's been Mir right just before him. There's been Sauda, Mirza Rafi Sauda, and there's been Mir Dard. So there's been a galaxy almost of Urdu poets, because the 18th century is the efflorescence of Urdu. But Ghalib chose not to emulate any of those poets. But, I mean, he could have followed Mir, the Khuda-e Sukhan, but he actually made obvious his admiration for Mirza Bedil. And so this is one thing that, you know, we need to keep in mind, that why did an Urdu poet decide to emulate a Farsi poet, and that too a Farsi poet who was a mystic, a qalandar. And the way he expressed his allegiance to Ghalib, Ghalib expressed his allegiance to Bedil, is also quite intriguing, and I will show you what he did. So here, this is the first page of Ghalib's first divan. It is known as I call it the 1816 divan. Ghalib was still 19 years old when he completed this divan. And the uniqueness about this divan is that it is in Ghalib's own hand. So what you see, all of this is Ghalib's own handwriting. Now, the dedication is something to note. And here he is saying, Ya Hassan, Ya Hussein, and in the middle there is Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And then he says, Abul Ma'ali Mirza Abdul Qadir Bedil Raziyallahu Anha. So he is dedicating, after Hassan and Hussein, he comes straight to Bedil. This is indeed very unusual. And then he closes the divan also with a dedication to Mirza Bedil. So it's not just that he's opening the 1816 divan with the invocation to Bedil, but also at the end he says, here we have Batarikh Chahar Dahum Rajab, etc., etc. And then he comes to Faqir Bedil. He calls himself Faqir Bedil Asadullah Khan Urf Mirza Nausha Mutakhallis Ba'asad Afwallah Anhu Az Tahrir Diwan Hasrat Unwane Khud. So Ghalib had this peculiarity of writing Khe, Vaw, Dal together. So Vaw and Dal are together here, see? Hasrat Unwane Khud Faragat Yafta Bafikre Kavishe Mazameen Digar Ruju Bajanib Ruhe Mirza Bedil Rahmatullah. So after, he's basically saying that after having earned a name for myself, after having this hasrat of getting a name for myself, now I'm going to turn towards Mirza Bedil and I'm going to look at the Mazameen Digar. So this is something that we will talk about more as I get deeper into this lecture. Now, what happens is that this is the 1816 divan, this is his first divan. After that, we get to the second divan, which is the 1821 divan. And in the 1821 divan, he continues with his praise of Mirza Bedil, and he actually has composed many ash'ar in which he is openly expressing his admiration for Mirza Bedil, and we will get to that. Now, let me just go back a little bit. Oh, so here is my translation of the Farsi. Having written this divan, the longing for earning a name for myself is fulfilled. In the search for other themes, the Mazameen Digar, I now turn to the spirit of Mirza Bedil. May God shower him with beneficence. So I'm going to explore the Mazameen Digar later on. But let's just go back a little bit here. And we have two verses. Here we have Bedil. در جستجوی ما نکشی زحمت سراغ جای رسیدیم که عنقا نمی رسد. Don't take pains to find a clue of me in your pursuit. I am at the place where even the anqa cannot reach. And then we have Ghalib, and this is from his first ghazal. Agahi dame shunidan jis qadar chahe bichhaye. Agahi dame shunidan jis qadar chahe bichhaye mudda'a anqa hai apne aalam-e taqreer ka. However much awareness can spread its nets, the goal of my state of speech or poetry is the anqa. So you can see the similarities between the ideas here. Bedil is saying, don't take pains to find a clue of me in your pursuit. I am at a place where the anqa cannot reach. So the anqa is a very interesting trope in Indo-Persian poetry. Anqa is compared to the phoenix. It's a bird that rises out of the ashes. But it doesn't exist. So the anqa doesn't exist. It is just an idea. It is an imaginary bird which doesn't exist. But at the same time, we all know that there is something called the anqa. Okay, so just keep that in mind. when we compare what Bedil has to say, I'm at the place where even the anqa cannot reach. Obviously, he is talking about anqa as imagination, you know. Don't take pains to find a clue of me in your pursuit. I'm at the place where even the anqa cannot reach. Ghalib has taken this mazmoon and he has taken it further. And he's saying, however much awareness can spread its nets, sorry, I keep slipping on it. By bringing in awareness, dame shunidan, and then connecting it to the state of speech and saying that the goal of my state of speech is the anqa. That means however much you can try to understand me, my goal itself is unreachable. So, you know, I mean, I could spend the whole lecture just describing this, just going into the details of what Ghalib has done with Bedil's initial thing. So one of the things I can just point out very quickly is dame shunidan. Shunidan means hearing. So the nets of awareness is how nets of, you know, hearing. And then in the second line he says state of speech. So hearing and speech sort of go together. And then spreading the nets is a good analogy which goes with anqa, because anqa is a bird, so anqa spreads its wings and awareness spreads its nets, and so on and so forth. So the very first ghazal in Ghalib's divan, you can see the influence of Bedil, and he didn't remove this from his divan in spite of the, I mean, it doesn't have a direct invocation of Bedil, but anyways. So the question then arises is, why did Ghalib select a Farsi poet as a model for his Urdu verse? Mirza Bedil represents the style of tāzah goi in Farsi, which is also known as Sabke Hindi or Mughal Safwid. But Mirza Bedil is not the only poet who is writing in this style. There is a whole slew of poets who represent the tāzah goi style. We have Kalim Kashani, we have Sahib Tabrizi, we have Naziri Nishapuri, we have Talib Amuli. There are all these poets who were actually from Iran, and they made their home in Hindustan, and they are buried there. But Ghalib decided to follow Bedil, and this is a question that I'm over and again trying to admire, trying to unravel. So we proceeded from 1816, that is the first divan, to 1821, that is the second divan, okay, and that is the largest divan. And in this divan, Ghalib has many, many verses in praise of Bedil. Now in 1827, Ghalib goes to Calcutta, and there he'd gone to pursue his pension case, but there he finds a very healthy literary scenario for Farsi, and there are mushairas that are being held, and these mushairas are both in Farsi and in Urdu, and Ghalib is invited to attend both. At the same time, there is his friend whose name is Sirajuddin Ahmad, and he's a publisher of a newspaper called Ain-e-Sikandar. So Sirajuddin Ahmad asked Ghalib to prepare a selection of his Farsi and Urdu verses. Now till then, Ghalib had not written much in Farsi. He had a total of only 455 verses, but in Urdu he had more than 2,000. So when he makes his selection, he decides to go in for 455 because that's all that he had in Farsi. So he calls this selection Gulerana, which means the two-sided rose or the two-sided flower. And he makes the selection of 455 verses from 2,000 Urdu verses. And the interesting thing is that all these verses are arranged according to the Radif. But the Farsi side of the book, which could have been easily arranged by Radif, he doesn't do that. So he just sort of pushes in the Farsi verses there. But he has written a very interesting dibache to Gulerana, in which he calls his poetry a garden. He says, my poetry is a garden, and it has two gates. One gate opens to Farsi, and the other gate opens to Urdu. And I invite the connoisseurs of Farsi to enter this garden and to appreciate this, what I have brought for them. And I will be very, very indebted and grateful. So the Gulerana, probably Ghalib had thought that his friend, because he was a publisher, he would publish the Gulerana, but this didn't happen. So Gulerana didn't get published, but many copies were made. So that's one part of his Calcutta visit. The other part is that he went to Mushairas, and there were some poets there who were Indians writing in Farsi, and they mocked some of Ghalib's usages. And Ghalib was very hurt, and he was also at the same time very angry. He wanted to respond to this in very strong terms, but he was held back by his friends because they thought that this matter can escalate and it can get into something very serious, and Ghalib can come to bodily harm. So they quieted him down. But Ghalib wrote a very long masnavi, a poem called Ashti Nama, which means basically, the first time he called it Bade Mukhalif, which means adverse winds. Later on, he changed it to Ashti Nama, which means a conciliation. So he called it Bade Mukhalif, which means adverse winds, and he came very strong against Indian-Persian poets. And he said, they don't know anything, and they are basically idiots, and look at me, I have learned my Farsi from Sadi, and so on and so forth. And everyone except Bedil, except Mirza Bedil, is somebody who I respect, but all the others are just trash. So he goes back to Delhi. I mean, his trip to Calcutta is unsuccessful because he doesn't get his pension restored and all of that. But he has in his pocket this idea of an intikhāb, which is what was Gulerana. So he had already prepared this intikhāb, and he has this idea that this is what he is now going to do with his Urdu verse. The other outcome of this Calcutta trip was that Ghalib began to compose in Persian more and more. And for the next 20 years, he only wrote in Farsi. And he amassed a huge, big volume of Farsi verses. So he goes back to Delhi, and by 1833, he has the selection ready. And from some 2,000 verses, he has culled 1,085. That means he had rejected or done mustarad half of his Urdu poetry. And he, the reason why we have the date 1833 is that he wrote the dibache also at this time, and he dated it. And so we have a copy of the dibache, but he couldn't find a publisher. It took him 7-8 years to find a publisher, and so finally in 1841, his first divan appears. Now, what he says in the first divan is very interesting, and also what he did in the first divan is also very interesting. I mean, I'm calling it the first divan, but technically it is the first published divan, because he already had a first divan, right? The 1816, and the second one was 1821, and then after that there was 1826. I mean, the whole thing about Ghalib is that you can track his journey from his teenage years to his mature years, because we have all of these manuscripts are available to us, fortunately. And it's only in examining these manuscripts that one gets to understand the trajectory of his poetic career. So the first published divan, which is in 1841, he has this dibacha or preface to it. And there he says, let me pull this up for you. Yeah. So this is look at this, how poor the paper is. You can almost see the second, the coming through. Yeah. And I actually, I have wonderful anecdotes about how I came across each one of Ghalib's divans, and I was able to actually hold them in my hand and copy them and take photos. So this divan, which is the 1841 divan, and there are only 2 existing copies in India and the whole world also, because and I was looking for it because I had heard that the Rampur library has it, and Rich and I had gone to Rampur tracking it, and it so happened that the Solat library where this divan is kept was closed for renovations. So we had to come back empty-handed. And then we were in Delhi, and I was affiliated with Jamia Millia and used to go there. Rich also was going there. And so he made friends with a lot of people over there. And so one day, he said that, there's a section upstairs where they have manuscripts displayed. So we went there, we were looking at the manuscripts in big glass boxes. And so the person in charge, he came up to me and he said, what are you working on? I said, Ghalib. He said, I have a very rare manuscript. I got very excited. He said, yes. So he went and he brought a key and he opened a Godrej almirah, and inside there was a locker, and he opened the locker and he took out this little book, absolutely small. And he said, this is the divan. I said, how can this be? Because I was so used to those magnificent manuscripts that I had been so far, seeing with all this gold and lajvat and all this decoration. So anyway, I looked at it and I said, this is not a manuscript, it's a lithograph, and it's a published, it's a published divan. He said, no. And I was like, he kept arguing with me. Anyway, allowed me to, make the scans. So in this dibache, which is very short, hardly 2.5 pages, Ghalib talks about the fact that he has some Indian wood, oud Hindi, okay? And what he wants to do is with the oud, so here, is the cursor working? Yeah, so I have gotten some oud Hindi, and what I have done with this is that I haven't chopped it up with an axe or something. I have actually whittled it very carefully. So when I have carved it and sculpted it, and now I'm ready to burn it in the hearth. So I need the Persian fire to ignite it. Isn't that interesting? I mean, you have Indian wood and you want to ignite it with a Persian fire. And then he says, but it's not that fire that has become dead and burnt to cinders in the Indian hearth. So what did he mean by that? What is the Persian fire that has burnt to cinders in the Indian hearth? This is a very peculiar thing that he says. And he goes on to say that is, which you now see clad in black on account of its own death and having become a handful of ashes. So, what is this fire that has become a handful of ashes, and then what is the fire that he is going to bring, which is going to ignite his oud? So this is a very enigmatic sentence, and I tried to find the answer. What did he mean by that? So possibly I thought that the dead fire was that genre of poetry in Farsi that was being composed by the Indian-Persian poets, because Ghalib was still hurting from the comments that he had received in Calcutta. And so he now wanted to turn to this other fire. And I am kind of making here a little bit of a leap, but I'm connecting it to the Mazameen-e Digar that he talks about earlier. You know, what is the mazameen-e-digar? What are these digar mazameen that he wants to speak about in his Urdu poetry? So, by that, does he mean the poets of the tāzah tradition? Well, we have to remember that Ghalib is writing in the 19th century and Bedil is in the 17th century, so there are 200 years that separate them. But this is something that I needed to get to the bottom of. You know, what was the mazameen-e-digar and what was the fire that had burned to ashes, and what was happening here. So I then began to first go back and look at the verses in which Ghalib has expressed his immense admiration for Bedil. And I found this verse, which was so hard, literally it was like a knife in my heart. It sort of twisted my heart, because he says, Mutribe dil ne mere taare nafas se Ghalib saaz par rishta pe naghme bhi dil bandha. Ghalib, my heart's musician, with the thread of my breath, stringed Bedil's song to the musical instrument. So, what more can one poet say about his admiration for another poet, that he actually, that Bedil's song is literally like his own breath, right? That's why he is stringing his instrument with Bedil's song. And there are other verses like that in which, here, tarz-i mein rekhta kehna Asadullah Khan qiyamat hai. Writing rekhta in Bedil style, Asadullah Khan, it is impossible. There's more of this style of poetry. Zameen ta falak naghme Bedil ast. So there's a lot of, and here, Asad harja sukhan ne tarhe baaghe tāzah dali hai, mujhe range bahari ja diye Bedil pasand aaya. So this I'm taking out directly from the 1821 divan, and what I found was that Ghalib later on took out all of these verses. He just discarded them. So what does it mean? I mean, he carried out this act of physically removing Bedil's poetry from his divan. These verses don't exist in Ghalib's published divan at all. But earlier he had done so much, you know, he had confessed that that Bedil was so close to him, that Bedil's poetry was like his own breath. So my point here is that this complexity, the complexity of this relationship between Bedil and Ghalib has not been explored fully, because there's much more going on in this. And there are two things, basically. One is, why did he choose Bedil, right, when he could have chosen someone else? Not just among the Farsi poets, but among the Urdu poets, and then among the tāzah, why did he choose Bedil? And then how does Bedil's way of thinking, you know, tarz-i Bedil, how does that align with Ghalib's tarz? I feel that the thing that is common between Bedil and Ghalib is the poetic temperament. And in my research, I found a word, a Sanskrit word that sort of nails this point, and that word is pratibhā. Pratibhā means being in the presence of words and meanings conducive to the composition of poetry. So pratibhā is a step ahead of mawzuniyat. You know, mawzuniyat means the ability to compose poetry, but pratibhā means being in the presence of words and meaning conducive to the composition. So pratibhā is not just the poetic temperament, but it is also the appreciation of the connection between language and imagination and between language and poetry. So, I kind of began to build on that. Ahang asad mein nahi juz naghma-e-bedil. So there is this naghma-e-bedil and there is the ahang, and all of that is being reflected in Ghalib. So I then, I was pursuing the Mazameen-e-Digar, and I felt that I needed to go and look at the position in which Ghalib was in his career as an Urdu poet and as a Farsi poet. And I feel that because Ghalib's Delhi was the Delhi where the influence of British ideas and poetic and literary parameters had started to infiltrate the literary scene. So, for example, we noticed that there is a cultural shift happening in this period. And so this cultural shift is something that was also happening during the time of Bedil, because there was this huge influx of writers from Iran who were settling down in India and who were interacting with Indic material. And that is what created this tarz-i, tarz-i. And the tarz-i is essentially a kind of poetry that is what is called khayal-band. That means it relies heavily on metaphors. And these metaphors were mostly drawn from the Indic tradition. So let us pause here and look at Bedil. Bedil is much more than a poet. He is also much more than a Sufi. I actually came up with a phrase to describe him, and it is, I call Bedil a literary saint, okay? And I say that as a literary saint, he has a miraculous presence. And because Bedil's life is full of, how to describe it, is full of amazing events. You know, he was born in Patna. His father died at a very early age, then his mother died, and then he was brought up by his uncle, who was a qalandar. And, you know, Bedil traveled a lot. He was educated by various teachers. Eventually, he settled in Delhi, where his admirer bought him a massive haveli. So Shukrullah Khan was a big follower of Bedil, and he bought him a haveli on the banks of the Jamna. And Bedil kind of settled down over there, and he wrote his own autobiography called Chahar Unsur, which is again a very difficult text. I mean, it tells us a lot about his life, but you have to, it's very difficult to read. So what happened is that once Bedil settled down in Delhi in this haveli by the Jamna River, he started holding gatherings, sama, of poets, musicians, and all kinds of devotees. And he himself was a figure that was larger than life. He was very tall, and he had a shaved head, and he had shaved eyebrows, and he had no beard. And he had a very athletic body, and he had a very strong and declarative singing voice. So he wasn't exactly, a Sufi in that sense of the term. he was also known to have a very large appetite, and he used to lift heavy weights. And he also concocted, herbal medicines for people who were, for fertility, kind of fertility drugs and other medicinal products. And he had a son who was born to him when he was 65, but died at the age of 4. So anyway, Bedil is this figure that is larger than life, okay? Whereas the other poets of the Tāzah tradition, really, they are poets, important poets in the Tāzah tradition, but they're not like Bedil. So when Bedil dies, he requested that he should be buried in the courtyard of his own house on a raised platform. And that is what was done. And after his death, a very interesting tradition began. So Bedil's Urs was celebrated every year. And the way it was celebrated was that poets would come from all over, and Bedil's divan was taken out, and it was opened. And so a kind of a bibliomancy tradition began to develop, that let's open the divan and see what Bedil has to say. And then it was circulated, and people would read out from Bedil's divan, and they would also recite their own verses. So this tradition continued from the time of his death in 1721, right, for the next 40 or 50 years. And some of the important poets of the time gathered there. We have other accounts, other contemporary accounts, like Dargah Quli Khan, who talks about this whole, this mela kind of thing, that was held around Bedil's grave. And there are other people who have described how they went there and they actually saw Bedil, or they imagined that they saw Bedil coming out of his grave and speaking to them. So this sort of thing developed, and Bedil himself, on the first flyleaf of his divan, he said that, my collection of thoughts is for the advantage of all. You should explore it and be comforted. So I found that in the figure of Bedil, there is much more than what we have been seeing so far. So far, we've just been seeing that Ghalib was influenced by Bedil, but we haven't really explored this other side of Bedil, this side where he comes across as this literary saint and a miraculous figure, which you find now if you start digging into the history of his thing. So now I'm going to bring up a verse of Ghalib in which he talks about the connection between the tradition of visiting Bedil's grave and getting inspiration. Now what happened is that after 1780, Bedil's grave disappeared. It was near the bank of the Jamna, and there was a flood, and then the grave disappeared. And there was speculation, and for a long time, there wasn't any way of finding out where Bedil was buried. Okay? So, in the meantime, what happens is that the Sajjada Nashin, Hasan Nizami of Hazrat Nizamuddin Auliya, he comes up with, he points to a place which is near Pragati Maidan, and he says, this is the site of Bedil's grave, and this is in 1941. So this is a picture from what the grave was looking like in the 1940s. Then recently, as interest in Bedil grew, his grave was restored It's a putative grave. You know, we don't know whether it was actually Bedil's grave, but this is what it looks like now. And then the situation became even more interesting because Prime Minister Modi wanted to, was trying to build cultural relations with Tajikistan, and he knew that, you know, everyone knows that Bedil is very popular there. So he got a miniature of this, you know, Bedil's grave made and took it, sent it with him. So these are some interesting asides. But what I'm pushing towards is that since in Ghalib's time, the tradition of going to Bedil's grave and getting, you know, opening his divan and getting some kind of guidance from him was no longer available, how was Ghalib going to do, you know, follow suit in this? So I came across this verse from Ghalib in the Nuskha Hamidiyya, and he says, Gar mile Hazrat-e Bedil ka khate lawh-e mazar, Asad aine pardaz maani mange. Which translates as, Asad, if you were to find Hazrat-e Bedil's tombstone, the aine pardaz, which means the embellished mirror, would ask for meaning. So this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. The second line, right? Aine pardaz maani mange. What is the meaning of this? So I looked at it very carefully and in the Nuskha Hamidiyya, and I noticed that, you know, look at this. It seems that there's something going on here. And it seems like it was a vow, and then it was made into a dal. See this? Yeah. So if we were to read this line as Asad aina parvaz maani mange, right? Yeah. No. So there are two readings possible, right? Yeah, that's right. Either you read it as embellished mirror, that is aina pardaz, or you read it as aina parvaz maani mange. You know, parvaz maani means elaboration of meaning. So you see, Ghalib is saying, if I were to find Bedil's grave and the tombstone, I would get, the inscription would ask for a higher level of meaning. So this prompted me to make the connection between Bedil as a literary saint who was venerated by a whole generation of poets, and Ghalib is one of them, is among them. So Ghalib's veneration of Bedil, apart from the fact that they share the same poetic temperament, is also pushed by this tradition of looking up to Bedil as this saintly figure who is guiding poets to find higher levels of meaning. So this is one of my contributions in trying to solve the intricacy of the Bedil and Ghalib relationship. So, you know, I feel that we are kind of entering into an area of metapoetics, where we are looking at how the creative process is being driven by new perceptions. You know, there's the old perception that Ghalib and Bedil, you know, have this interrelativity. But then there is this other angle now, a more physical angle to it, which is Bedil as this literary saint who has a whole slew of followers, and Ghalib is following in that tradition as well. And then the third thing is that Ghalib is living in a time where a lot of change is happening. And Ghalib needs to grapple with this change. You know, he needs to understand how to negotiate all of these changes that are happening. And who better than Bedil, whose poetry is often a play between illusion and reality. So going back to the Anqa verse, Bedil and Ghalib both are exploring this idea that there is a level of imagination where imagination also cannot reach. So there is this confusion between what is real and what is unreal. And in this regard, Ghalib found Bedil to be a very, very useful model. So even though Ghalib is not a Sufi, he liked this idea of illusion and reality and, you know, building upon the mirror as this trope of what is real and what is unreal. And in this regard, he felt that the classical Persian tradition did not show him the ways to deal with this. So therefore, the classical Persian tradition did not suit his creative vision. I hope I'm making this clear. I'm making a very delicate point here, that the classical Persian tradition did not suit Ghalib's creative vision, and falling back on Bedil, whose creative vision suits his purposes. So that is why we can say that the mazameen-e-digar that he's looking for actually come to him from Bedil. Ghalib was in search of new meanings and fresh perceptions to grapple with his awareness of change. And how to come to terms with all of this change that is happening. Questioning reality is both a subjective experience and a defining feature of imagination and human awareness. So when we question reality, we are actually trying to experience the interaction between imagination and human awareness, you know. So this is something that Ghalib liked and appreciated and took on. The mirror is a perfect trope for hayrat or wonder. Objects in the mirror that are not tangible, nor are they what they seem to be. Mirror is also a trope for the heart in Sufi parlance. It reflects God's glory. Bedil speaks to finding a way through this. So Ghalib sought guidance from Bedil. He borrowed themes from Bedil, but he also added themes of his own. One particular theme that Ghalib added is the theme of na-rasai, or frustration. Ghalib expresses frustration in the failure of language to communicate thoughts, or maybe it is frustration at large. And this is why he resorts to ambiguity. And I'm going to quote a sher that is really, really mind-boggling in its vision. Har qadam duriye manzil hai numaya mujhse. Har qadam duriye manzil hai numaya mujhse. Meri raftar se bhage hai beaba mujhse. So at every step, the duriye manzil, the distance of the goal, is apparent. Every step that I take towards the goal, it goes further, right? And how does it go further? Meri raftar se bhage hai beaba mujhse. So the speed at which I'm running, at the same speed, the goal is also running. So we are both running parallel. Or Seeing my speed, मेरी रफ्तार से भागे है बेआबा मुझसे. Seeing my speed, my goal begins to run extra fast and I can't catch it. So हर कदम दूर ये मंजिल है नुमाया मुझसे, मेरी रफ्तार से भागे है बेआबा मुझसे. It's sort of the ultimate expression of frustration. हूँ गर्मी निशात तसव्वुर से नग़्मा संज, मैं अंदली वे गुलशन आना आफरीदा हूँ. I sing from the joy of my imagination. I am the bulbul of a garden that has yet to be created. I mean, just think.
Could you read the original?
Yeah. Hoon garmi-e nishat-e tasawwur se naghma sanj. Main andalib-e gulshan-e na afrida hoon. I am the bulbul of the garden that is still to be created. And I'm singing from the warmth of my imagination. This is Ghalib for you. And then another one. Kiya hai tarke dunya kahili se, hame hasil nahi behasili se. Either way, we can't attain our goals, even if we give up or we continue to do so. So these are some verses that I have just pulled out from my memory. But we see a poet taking on the ghazal with renewed vigor. So Ghalib has taken the ghazal from its traditional moorings of heavy emotion, unrequited love, pain, all of those things, to this level of questioning reality and trying to use imagination as a way of expressing the frustration of the human mind with change, So I know, I'm sounding quite abstract here, but I hope that what I'm trying to say can be simplified by just saying that Ghalib is trying to change literary ideals. And he uses Urdu as the language of change. So that is the difference between his Farsi poetry and his Urdu poetry. In Urdu, he is using the Persian fire to ignite Oud Hindi, this is pretty fascinating. But in Farsi, he's very traditional. His Farsi poetry is very traditional. He just follows the great masters. And to some extent, he does conform with tatabbuʻ because he can't give up his temperament, right? His temperament is that way. So he has to complicate things, but it's in Urdu that he achieves all these heights of Bedilian philosophical view of life. And here, I can kind of conclude with Asad harja sukhan ne tarhe baghe taza dali hai. So we are talking about tarhe baghe taza. So sukhan means poetry. Asad, everywhere, new kinds of poetry have been, are being put forward. Mujhe range bahar ijadiye bedil pasand aaya. But I liked, or Bedil's style of the taza goi, Bahar ijadiye bedil, matlab, it means that Bedil's invention of describing spring. There's a connection between two because he first says baghe taza. So in munasabat between baghe taza and bahar ijad. But he took out all of these verses from his divan. I mean, these are master verses, except that they show his appreciation of Bedil. So all of these verses were taken out from his divan. But as I have tried to show in my lecture, how he is recreating Bedil's ideas in his own poetry, and in spite of excising Bedil physically from his divan, nonetheless, the complexity of the Bedil-Ghalib relationship can be understood from not just one angle, but from different angles. And I'm going to stop here. And questions. Thank you.
Really brilliant presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And I really like the way you puzzle out the relationship between Bedil and Ghalib. One question that I have is that the period that he turns to Persian writing in 1920s, 30s?
28, yeah. 1828.
Is at the height of this sort of force to push out Persian as the language of court and language of intellectual discourse in India. And it seems like there seems to be a political, linguistic undercurrent of some sort of resistance to that, because he goes against the British colonial language policies by fostering and writing, as you noted, only in Persian. And sort of this entanglement with Oud Hindi and Atash Farsi, and it really puts together this literary complex, and how he's trying to sort of find his own way, and Bab Tazeh, or tarz Tazeh that he wants to create.
Yeah, I mean, your question has many parts to it, and I can unpack one at a time. So to answer your question about Farsi, it was the official language till 1837. And Ghalib's sort of moving towards Farsi happens before that, 10 years before that. I think it has to do with the revelation that he had upon reaching in Kolkata, that Farsi is a language that is going beyond the borders of Hindustan, A. And B, Farsi has this huge, long, deep classical tradition, which Urdu doesn't have. So what he's doing is he's using Farsi, the Persian fire, to bring changes into Urdu, And this is a very fine point that I'm making, which a lot of people haven't really seen, because most people don't read his dibache. So all his dibache, and he has like 3-4, are written in Persian, in the style of the period, which is a little bit floral, but nonetheless, there is a lot of meaning in it, and you have to be patient and tease out the meaning. I also found that the dibache to his Urdu divan is short and to the point, and he just begins with Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, and then he comes straight to the point, whereas his dibache to his Persian divan is like 20 pages long, and it has a lot of lafazi, and it has poetry thrown into it, and he talks about his muse and this and that, and he's very traditional in that. He doesn't talk about the revolutionary things that he's doing in Farsi.
Just about his dibache, if I recall correctly, he was also in this sort of pure Persian style of writing.
That happened later. That happens even later. So he, after Persian begins to lose its ascendancy, the Urdu people began to, panic a little bit, because they felt that there was this deep connection between Urdu and Farsi. And so Parsi needed to be preserved as the classical language, and to be the master of a classical language would be seen as the top-notch poet. So then Ghalib sort of wants to have this mantle. He wants to be seen as the great Persianist of his age. And then he tries to do these things, like write in pure Persian, the Dasatiri mode. He does all of these things. And he gets into big fights with other people. And he begins to critique others. And then he also does an interesting thing. He invents a tutor for himself. He says, my Persian is very current because there was this guy named Abdus Samad. He was a Zoroastrian. His name was Hormuzd. And he converted to Islam. And he took on this name. And he came to Agra. But before this, he never mentioned him. So once he got into these controversies, then he brought this guy out. But it is possible. I mean, I do believe that Abdus Samad did exist because he wasn't Ghalib's tutor. He wasn't Ghalib's ustad. He was actually a person who taught Ghalib the current usages of Persian. It's not, it's hard to say whether he existed or not, but Ghalib brought him into the conversation. So all this is Ghalib's.
Professor Farooqi, will you take some online questions? Mm-hmm. We have Professor Kishwamurthy. Please unmute yourself.
Oh, hi. Thank you for the lovely talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. I had a question about what you say, and I agree that it's a very interesting question why Ghalib takes Bedil as a kind of lodestar rather than someone else. And I wanted to sort of make a point that the literary critic Mahmoud Futuhi has made in an essay. He has a wonderful essay on Sa'ib Tabrizi, and where it's called Manshaw-e-Sher, that Sa'ib Tabrizi, and he argues that the exaltation of the imagination as a kind of autonomous ability from the other faculties is something he also sees in Mullah Sadra, right? Safavid, Iran's most famous philosopher. So the autonomization of the imagination happens in Sadrian philosophy, but also in Sa'ib as well. And Sa'ib, as you know, spent 7 years in India, but you already have this sort of exaltation of the imagination. You have even among the Kozegui poets who don't come to India. Sa'ib spends only 7 years of his life in Hindustan, but you have a poet like Shaukat Bukharai, who never sets foot in India. You have a poet to whom Khan-e-Arzu wrote an entire divan in Jawab. What's his name? Shafia Asad from Lahore in Iran. And he's blind, he never leaves Lahore. But he also, in his divan also, you see the sort of exaltation of the imagination. So Futuhi argues that what you see at this point in both Mullah Sadra and Sa'ib is the concept of the creative imagination, which has world-making abilities. It produces imaginary forms in place of the traditionally receptive one, right, that reflected them. So rather than a mimetic model of imagination, you have a poetic or creative model of imagination. And could it be that since Bedil was this period's most copious exploiter of Ibn Arabi's themes, so Sa'ib was not, Akbarianism doesn't run through his Mazamin in the way that it does through Bedil. And that combined with the sort of world-making ability of imagination in Bedil is perhaps what endeared Bedil to Sa'ib, because that would explain, that way you wouldn't need a biographical explanation, right? That Bedil is from Delhi and Ghalib is from that kind of explanation. It also explains the fact that the exaltation of the imagination in poetry, in Persian poetry of the ghazal of the period, is also present in poets who have nothing to do with Sanskrit, nothing to do with India.
But then how do you, sorry, Prashant, thank you for this question. This is, it helps me think more. But then how do you explain this Khat-e Lawh-e Mazar thing? This was...
So, that may be a, verse of veneration, but why should that be, let's say, proof that, because, even if it's an expression of veneration, but that wouldn't explain the way he's using the imagination as world-making, which you also see in Sa'ib, you see in Shaukat Bukharai, right? You don't see it in Baba Fiqani. I'm talking about the ghazal corpuses of these authors, right? So, and he, so I think, it would be the author, because I think what's distinctive about the 17th century 17th, 18th centuries across the swathe of Eurasia, the Persianate world in particular, is Akbarianism, which runs through, you see it in, for example, 17th century literature in Chinese, Muslim literature in Chinese is basically a Neo-Confucianism that interacts with Ibn Arabi, right? And even there you see an autonomization of the imagination, precisely in the 17th century period, Sa'ib's period, right? But Sa'ib doesn't inherit Akbarian mazameen, and he doesn't use Akbarian to the degree that Bedil does, right? So I would say that that's what allows Ghalib, that's what endears Bedil to Ghalib. That's what sort of, makes him amenable to appropriation for Ghalib, who's trying to, what's Ghalib really about? So many of his ghazals, his Urdu ghazals in particular, they're about world making, right? So.
Yeah, I agree with you. But what I'm also trying to do is trying to tease out more meaning into the fact that Ghalib uses Bedil more in his Urdu verse.
Yes.
So, what exactly, how he is using Urdu, this modern language, to grapple with some of these problems and things that you and I, we are talking about, and doesn't really do that in Farsi.
Right.
At least to the limit that I have read Ghalib. And I'm falling back on, the comparison between the Dibache, which is so stark, the way he has written his Urdu Dibache to his Urdu divan and his Farsi divan. It's like there are two different Ghalibs over here, almost.
Right. So maybe they're doing different, there's a division of aesthetic labor between them, maybe, you know better than I do. But I'm just suggesting a sort of, let's say, aesthetical, philosophical reason rather than a biographical one for why Bedil worked for Ghalib.
Yeah, I know you criticize my biographical strain in my work. But, I'm trained as a historian, and I always somehow, that part I can never ignore. It always sort of comes into my work, and
your work is much the richer for it. It's a wonderful book, I know that as well. So
I was hoping you would be here and we could hang out and talk more about all of it.
Come, 6 hours away. Thank you, though.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yes.
I have a rather strange question. You introduced the Sanskrit word
pratibhā.
And what I find very interesting, because Sanskrit is also a very old language, was there any collaboration between the Urdu poets and the Farsis? I didn't know that there were so many Farsi poets who come to India. And the people who wrote in Sanskrit, was there any sort of interaction at all?
There's plenty of interaction between Iranians and what is happening in Indian literary production. I don't think Sanskrit is the main focus in the 17th to 18th, 19th century, which is the period that we are looking at. But, the classical Sanskrit works are always there, and the Persian poets are either second-hand or first-hand. They are imbibing all of this. So, and they are using those ideas in helping them navigate the changing cultural milieu, or whatever you want to say it, imagination, how the Sanskrit poets have used imagination. There have been studies on that. It's actually beyond my pale, but I could guide you to people who have worked on this.
I've learned so much today, because this is not an area that I'm familiar with. So I really thank you.
Yeah, Sanskrit is a little beyond my,
No.
yeah. But thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
Thank you for the question. Yes.
Just had one. Is there any particular reason why Ghalib would lean to Bedil? Is it the difficult nature of him, or is it more like Mani Afrini kind of? Like somewhere in there's a verse of his in Persian where he says, "Sukhane sada dilam na fare batwari," and so on. So is it that? Is it like that his preference for difficult verse, or is it more like the multiple meanings of Mani Afrini?
Good question. You know, Ghalib likes ambiguity. He loves ambiguity. He's not really a difficult poet in that sense, because if something is difficult, you can still solve it. But if something is ambiguous, you can't really get to the bottom of it. You can only have a perspective on it, on what he's trying to say. And that's why it becomes enjoyable, but it also becomes very frustrating. And I've often thought that would Ghalib have had the same reputation as he has if he had allowed all of his verses to be included in his divan? What the reception of that divan would have been? Because there's a whole bunch of things that, you just don't understand what he's trying to say. I've just published this book on his Mustarad, and honestly, I got so much help from my father in trying to understand those verses. They were so hard. They were so ambiguous. Even Prashant helped me with one of them. So you don't understand really what is the purpose, except that the poet is pushing the limits of imagination, and the poet doesn't care really if it doesn't go across. Something on those lines.
There is an online question, if I can read it for you.
Okay, yeah, sure.
The person asked, I wonder why Bedil, why basically he doesn't have a good English translation. Compared to other poets, better English translation. Nobody has come across a very good translation in English.
That's a very good question and very important. Why doesn't Bedil have good translations in English? Ghalib has so many people have translated Ghalib, but I don't think any of those translations can be called good translations, because it's just very difficult. It's very difficult to translate a line which has so many different meanings. When I'm trying to translate Ghalib, I usually, not always, but in some cases, I give multiple translations. Translation 1, translation 2, translation 3. And that might help. And that's why you need a commentary also. So I think Bedil deserves a lot more than he has received. But I think, as things are going, Indo-Persian has received a lot of push recently. And Ustad Tawakkuli is here, who is one of the movers in this regard. So we are hoping there'll be more work in this field. Yes, Aqsa.
I actually have a very basic question. So why do you think he excises Bedil from his?
Yeah.
That's a very intriguing question.
I know.
So he pays homage, and then it's like what highway robbery.
Yeah.
He gets whatever he wants from Bedil, and then he just removes them.
I think that's because when he got into this fight with the Indian poets, he began to say horrible things about them, pointing fingers at their ancestry and so on, and saying, what does he know? And so he must have felt, Bedil is an Indian Farsi poet, and maybe I should remove just to be consistent. I can only guess.
His veneration for Bedil doesn't.
I know. He doesn't. See, he's a very interesting character, Ghalib.
But maybe not, because it's sort of those lines may have been a source of inspiration, and then when he reaches there, it's like a ladder that you move away.
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting way of looking at it.
Interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah. Parvaz, he has done the parvaz, he doesn't
Left
use the
the
ladder
nest.
anymore.
Leaves the nest now.
So, but he knows that all those verses are there, right, for posterity. Yeah. Because multiple copies have been made of those divans.
At some point, he ceases poetic expression in Farsi, and he returns to
Urdu
for the rest of his life.
Mm-hmm. But that's the tail end of his life. Yeah. He's old and frail. He also returns to Urdu He used to write all his letters in Farsi, but towards the end of his life, he just started writing in Urdu. So that's also a very interesting part. Actually, I could write many more books on Ghalib. I'm not boasting, but I could, because there are all these things that people haven't really investigated properly.
Age of Persian purism.
Yeah. And this relationship that a poet has, a poet who's a bilingual poet, and this creative relationship between one language and the other language. And you are writing in both, but towards the end of your life, you fall back on your first language, let's say, or maybe Farsi is not as...
What is most familiar to you?
What is most familiar to you?
Persian for him is a language of aspiration.
Yeah, yeah. And then he actually sets a new style in writing letters, which becomes a model. So
you should definitely write those books.
Yeah. I will try, yes.
I was wondering if Ghalib only was influenced by Bedil, or we can see the trace of other Persian poets such as Hafiz.
Yeah. He did read all these poets. He was fond of Urfi. But Naziri, people have done studies in which the common practice is to just draw two sets of columns and say, okay, in this Beher, in this Zameen, so-and-so has composed these verses, and then there are similar verses composed by... But that really doesn't mean anything. What is more important is an engagement in which poet B takes that idea and goes further with it. Only then you can, say that there is a real engagement going on. Otherwise, I don't think poets sit down and say, okay, now this verse, I'm going to write something on this verse. I don't think people operate that way. But I feel that the cultural attachment is very strong, and that sort of draws the Ghalib to Bedil also. That could be one of the things. Although I'm just being a little speculative here. Yeah.
Any role of maybe Mustar, who we maybe usually used to consult in terms of verses, with regards to him moving to Persian or anything like that?
What? I didn't get the first part.
Is there any role that we know of Mustar Khairabadi?
Oh, Mustar Khairabadi. Oh, yeah. He was friends with him. And, it's just like Ghalib was too full of himself, if I can say that. So the idea that he could actually listen to someone's advice is, I don't think he did. He just did what he wanted to do. Yeah.
Maybe that's why he removed Bedil.
That could be one reason, yeah. And as Ustad suggests that, he removed the ladder. He said, okay, now I'm on that.
I found my wings.
I found my ways. But all of those other things are there when he's calling himself Faqir Bedil. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for this fascinating work. I was wondering, when you mentioned about poetic temporality, or the idea of a presence, that was not quite clear to me. And I would like to know, because that's the first comment they
I just want to add something if I can.
That's the first commonality between Bedil and Ghalib. And I would like to know if how do you compare that? How you compare that specific commonality to other Persian
I just wanted to add something if I...
Please go ahead. Yeah.
I don't know
Who's this?
Go ahead.
Is there someone online wants to say something?
Bilal? Are you?
This is what happens, and this is what happens when we have hybrid.
Well, actually, let's get Sarah's question first, and then I've just messaged the questioner. Yeah, that we'll get to them next. Yeah. Please.
Yeah.
Please.
No, you can just condense it a little bit. Yeah.
For the poetic temporality, you mentioned they go beyond the poetic temporality. There is some certain presence that they have, which you related to meaning and reality and language. I didn't get that. That was quite not clear to me. And that specific aspect, how do you compare that to other poets? I mean, in addition to Bedil, is there any other poet that you know in Persian literature?
Oh yeah. So this is a good question. So this whole bunch of poets who write in what is known as the tāzah style, they all do this, have this practice which is called khayal bandi, which means you take a distant idea and you bring it through metaphor. And it's very abstract. It requires a certain kind of temperament to write in this way. So this style didn't go down very well with people in Iran. They didn't like this style, so they sort of undermined those poets. But it didn't go away, because it was a very good method of interacting with reality. What is reality and what is illusion, and how can we put a question mark on reality? It's a bit of a, I know it's a difficult thing to pin down, but maybe if you read the paper, it might be clearer. I'm still working on it.
I'll communicate with you later.
Yes. And I can share some, excerpts from the paper. The poet is always traversing this line between language and thought. How to put thought in language, and to elevate it through imagination, boundless imagination, and then how to capture. So the idea of anqa becomes very handy over here, because anqa doesn't exist, but we know that there is anqa, right? So that idea really helps poets to do.
Now they augment reality in a way. That's how they make reality real.
Yes, like the mirror, like the image in the mirror.
Yeah.
That example.
Yeah, I think astrophysics is called dark matter.
We have a question online from Professor Karen Pinto.
Okay.
Please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me? Is that okay? Yes. Yeah. I just wanted to actually share something. Professor, I'm very happy to hear about your work. मैं कराची से हूँ, so I really appreciate the Urdu poetry, but I work in Persian and Arabic, and I just wanted to share with you from my book I wrote. It's just a very simplistic Ghalib poem, but I put a Ghalib poem to start my book on medieval Islamic maps, so I was going to read it to you. इल्म ने मुझसे कहा इश्क है दीवानेपन, इश्क ने मुझसे कहा इल्म हो तखमीन और जान. And then I skipped the other lines and just put the last two. इल्म है पैदा सवाल, इश्क है पनहान जवाब, इल्म है इब्न अल किताब, इश्क है उम्म अल किताब.
That's a Quran, right?
Yeah, it's about, yeah. I just wanted to tell you I put that in my book, so I want to share it with you. But yeah, it's a book.
I couldn't hear you.
I believe Professor Pinto was just reciting some verses that were quoted in a forthcoming book, and wanted to read them out for your adulation and appreciation. Thank you very much for
Just an appreciation. I wish I had Ghalib in there.
Please email me. That would be, I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, I will do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see that the time is probably coming to an end. Maybe we can take one more, or I see Janab Bedar Bakht and others have joined online. Welcome to them all. Shaheen Ahmed and Shariar Ahmed and family are also there. If anyone would like to ask anything or give their remarks, and also in the audience, please. We will have to wrap up now.
Well, Professor Farooqi, thank you very much for this outstanding for the mental gymnastics for me.